Hello, welcome to Lecture 8, Part 3 for Life in the Universe, continuing with our Unit C. And here we're going to take a look at a bit about the structure of living cells. Not nearly in the detail we would in biology class, but enough so that we have some idea of what's probably the fundamental things about them that we might want to look for in extraterrestrial life. Now, but just a little bit before we start that, um, back in Unit A, I think I gave you a list of some properties of life that biologists would typically list and say, well, what are the properties of living organism? And anyway, I don't want to look at all of these in this unit, but in this unit, I do want us to take a look at these four possibilities here: organization, metabolism, reproduction, and evolution. And we're going to spend more time on organization than any of the others. The rest of this lecture and the next one, Lecture 9, will be about organization. And then Lecture 10 will be those last three right there. And so this is why we're going to take a look at cells, because when we go into organization, it turns out that the basic unit of organization of terrestrial organisms is, in fact, the cell. And if you've ever studied biology, you probably know that. Now, you also probably know that cells themselves have smaller structures in them, and we call these smaller structures in them organelles. Uh, Basically, they're kind of like they are to the cell what an organ like your liver is for a full organism. And as I'm sure you're aware, multicellular organisms typically have specialized cells that perform specific functions. So your brain cells, for example, are very different from your skin cells, which are very different from your bone cells, and so forth. Single-celled organisms, there's not much specialization, rather obviously, because they're just a single cell. Now, one thing I will never be able to forget, thanks to my high school biology teacher, is the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So my high school biology teacher had this habit of, I don't know, every 2 or 3 weeks, would go in and he'd announce to the class that he had a assignment for us due the next day, a one-page paper on whatever topic he gave us. And I think it might have been the first topic he gave us was on the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. Now, I should point out this was the 1980-81 school year. So I think the internet in some form may have already existed, but if it did, I had never heard of it. There was no Wikipedia. So that meant you actually had to use books to look this information up. And even though I had a decent encyclopedia set, it wasn't as good as the Britannica at the public library. So usually when he gave these assignments, that meant I knew that after school I was going to be going to the public library. Well, anyway, prokaryotic cells, or prokaryotes, are cells that do not have a cell nucleus. And they're relatively simple. They're this kind of a cartoon bacterium, and then a actual microscopic view of the bacterium to illustrate a typical prokaryote. It turns out besides bacteria, there's another big grouping of prokaryotes called archaea. Anyway, there are more details than we need here because we're not doing a biology class. But here what's labeled is the bacterial chromosome. That's the genetic material of the bacterium, which is just free floating within the cell. And I'll also point out these tiny little red dots here, which are little structures called ribosomes. We'll say a little bit more about them in a bit. The other type of cells, eukaryotic cells or eukaryotes, are larger and more complex. Among other things, they do have a cell nucleus, which means that the genetic material of the DNA is, the chromosomes are contained inside the subcompartment of the cell, the nucleus. Now, for us to say a little bit more about this, eukaryotes include all animals, so we're eukaryotes. uh, plants, fungi, and there are a number of single-celled eukaryotes, and a number of different, not very closely related lineages that these days in general are called protists. Now, being a more complex cell here, there's a lot more here than we need to worry about. Besides the fact that it has a nucleus, I'll just point out the following two things. One is it has ribosomes, again, barely visible, at least on my computer screen here, little red dots kind of stuck around on that membrane there. And then it has these structures here, which are called mitochondria. Mitochondrium is or mitochondrion is the singular. And the mitochondria are very interesting because they're about the size of a typical bacterium. And independently of the nucleus, mitochondria have their own DNA and their own ribosomes. And so that is actually a clue to a very interesting point in the history of life on Earth, which we'll say probably more about today and more about in the next unit. Okay, just another example of a eukaryotic cell. This is a generic plant cell. So again, we've got a nucleus. It contains the chromosomes, which are chromosomes are mostly DNA. Chromatin is a protein that provides some structure to the DNA. The chromosome plus chromatin basically is the chromosome. It has ribosomes. It has mitochondria. But plants also have this interesting organelle called a chloroplast. That's actually where the photosynthesis takes place in plant cells. And it turns out the chloroplast, which is also comparable in size to a typical bacterium, also has its own DNA and own ribosomes. So what's going on with these organelles within eukaryotic cells that have their own ribosomes and own DNA? So again, like we said, we have that here in the mitochondria. So this cartoon view shows you the DNA and then the ribosomes there. And then here is a cartoon showing it for a little more of the structure here for a chloroplast, where again, they have their own DNA, own ribosomes. And this DNA for both the mitochondria and chloroplast is separate from the nuclear DNA. Let's put the secret code for the attendance here. There's a little bit more to do after this. Robert Hooke, mostly known as a physicist, he was a contemporary of Newton's, but he did a lot of the early microscopic work on microorganisms, and he is the person who introduced the term cell into biology. Previously, cell just means a small room or chamber, and so he's the one who had the idea of applying it to biology. So pretty important contribution. So here's a drawing of one of the microscopes he used, which I guess looks recognizably like a microscope. All right, Robert Hooke's microscope is our code then. All right, now a little bit more. Let's say a little bit about the structure of cell membranes, because presumably getting a membrane is one of the first things we need to do if we're going to build a cell. And so we have two different kind of sketches of the type of molecule that make them up. Generally, they're called phospholipids, and they're made up of a number of components. So in the view over here on the right, this is kind of a view representing each atom in this phospholipid molecule as a ball of different colors. So the yellow one there is phosphorus atom. The red are oxygen. There's one nitrogen atom, kind of a light blue that you see there. The black is carbon, and then the gray here are the hydrogens. And then over here is kind of a schematic way of showing the structure of the atom or the molecule, how the atoms are connected to each other. And then down here on the tails here, what are labeled fatty acids over here. And if you look at an organic chemistry textbook, you'll see lots and lots of diagrams like this. So when you just see these little wiggly lines representing a molecule, because chemists would get very tired if they had to write a C and H's for every place there's a carbon and a hydrogen. So at every point on this diagram, it's understood that there's a carbon with as many hydrogens are left to stick onto it. And I will make a little remark here for terms, you know, here it's labeled fatty acids. I'm sure you've heard the term saturated and unsaturated fat. Well, the tail here that's straight is saturated. And what that means is that the carbon atoms in that tail have as many hydrogen atoms as they could have stuck to them. They're saturated with hydrogen. The one here, this other one that's got a kink in it, is unsaturated. In fact, it's mono-unsaturated because you could get more hydrogen on it. And because more hydrogen atom could be there, but it's not there, you have a couple of the carbon atoms are making a double bond instead of a single bond, and that's what puts the kink and the curve there. Now, note that although this molecule, which I would describe as kind of a medium-sized molecule, big, small, medium molecule to medium, it's still actually only composed of a small number of elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. That's all. Just 5 elements make that up. So the level of the elements that go in, quite simple, but combining them this way, and combining a fair number of them, you get something a bit more complex. I'll also point out here, this thing right here, where you've got a phosphorus atom surrounded by 4 oxygen atoms. That's called a phosphate group. And those actually show up quite a lot in biochemistry. Okay, so this part here, everything but the fatty acids part, is referred to as the head of the molecule. And here over here, see it's called hydrophilic. And the fatty acid tails here are called hydrophobic. Hydrophilic and hydrophobic literally mean water-loving and water-fearing. Now, a part of a molecule can't really be afraid of or really be in love with water. But what that means, the hydrophilic part of the molecule is attracted to water molecules, and the hydrophobic part is repelled by them. And what that means, if you take a bunch of these phospholipids, which can form pretty easily as long as you've got the right ingredients here, and if you throw them into water, what happens is they tend to form this double layer with the hydrophilic heads pointing out and the hydrophobic tails pointing in, the water on either side. And so they spontaneously form these membranes, which presumably would be one of the first steps in building a cell. Now, if this was all it was to the membrane, it probably wouldn't be a very successful cell because it would be very hard to get anything through the membrane to get nutrients into the cell or waste materials out. So we're going to conclude this video and concluding this lecture by just a little bit of an introduction to proteins. We're going to talk about proteins in a lot more detail in the next lecture, because even if extraterrestrial life doesn't use the exact same type of molecules, it's going to have something that's going to serve the role of proteins. So proteins are big molecules, and we'll see what we mean by a big molecule, here represented by these purple blobs. And these particular proteins are used for transport through the membrane, although it's going to see a lot of different proteins and do a lot of different functions. And so for one of these transport proteins, the idea is, let's say we have some molecule up here that we need to transport to the other side of the cell membrane. Well, there'll be a particular protein in that cell membrane for whatever it is we want to transport through. And so if it comes along and encounters that protein, it will chemically react with that protein. And as a result, that will change the shape of the protein through that chemical reaction, moving the thing it's trying to transport to this side. And then another chemical reaction removes the transported molecule. And then the protein can go back to its original shape. And when nasty little things like viruses, like the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19, the way they typically get into a cell is there'll be a something on the surface of the virus. It's actually a virus protein that will attach to one of the proteins in the cell membrane, and through that way gain entry into the cell. But proteins do a lot more than that, and we'll start learning about that in our next lecture, in lecture 9. Obviously, I will let you know when the lecture 9 videos are available. It would be very sneaky for me to not tell you. Well, that's the first thing they'll expect. No, I will let you know when the lecture 9 videos are available. And although I'm probably going to send out the email announcing these on Sunday evening, so you can start watching them on Monday morning, I'm recording this on a Friday afternoon, and I'm looking forward to it being almost the weekend. So we'll meet in lecture 9 when we will continue with Unit C and learn more about proteins and how to make really big molecules from a small number of relatively simple units.